So now let's move on to our main event this evening. It's my great pleasure to introduce you all tonight to our first speaker, Dr. Wilfred McClay. Dr. McClay is a professor of history at Hillsdale College in Michigan. Before that, he held the G.T. and Libby Blankenship Chair in the History of Liberty at the University of Oklahoma. He served from 2002 to 2013 on the National Council on the Humanities, the Advisory Board for the National Endowment for the Humanities, and is currently serving on the U.S. Semi-Quincentennial Commission, which is planning for the 250th anniversary of the United States to be observed in 2026. His most recent book, Land of Hope, An Invitation to the Great American Story, which won ISI's Conservative Book of the Year Award in 2020. He was educated at St. John's College and received his PhD from Johns Hopkins. And tonight, Dr. McClay will be speaking to us on history as a way of knowing. Dr. McClay.
Thank you, James. It's wonderful to look out at so many friends and hopefully friends to be, since that's one of the objects of this whole thing. I had the experience of going to the first of these honors programs many moons ago. It was back in the last millennium, and in Montana. And it was just getting off the ground. Jeff and I were talking about it. There were no events planners involved. There was really just a couple of people kind of pulling their hair out and trying to figure out how to run things. The process, this vetting process that he's described, did not go on as it has for all of you. So we had some real winners among the students who were there. I don't know if anybody other faculty here experienced that, but and I hadn't been invited back since then. I wonder why, whether I didn't behave myself or something. Maybe I drank indiscreetly. So I'm going to refrain tonight then. But no, what the point I want to make is that this, in a small way, tells you something about the difference between the foundational idea of something and its realization in time. That in a very small way, the development and the realization of what the honors program has become is something that is not apart from the idea that initiated it, but it also owes a lot to events and to a learning process and to institutional rising and falling and all the vicissitudes that occur in the course of historical development. So James mentioned, this is another way of getting at this, my topic. He mentioned that I'm a graduate of St. John's College in Annapolis. I don't know whether any of you have any experience there, I think. Oh, well, anchors away. No, that's right. I noticed you're very first on the list. Yes. Well, we'll talk about croquet later on, but St. John's is the quintessential great books school, and they make quite a to-do of reading books without reference to scholarly apparatus. Eva Brand, the great figure there, always says, if I find out you've read the introduction to your book, I'm going to tear it out of the book. And she did not want us to encounter the books except as in as unmediated a way as possible. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. But obviously you could feel the but coming. When a few years out of college, I was reading something about Thomas Hobbes. And I was working as an editor at that time, and I didn't have any intention to go in graduate school in the career I ended up taking. And it dawned on me in reading this article that I had never been aware of the fact that, or at least maybe I knew, but had not taken in the fact that Hobbes was writing in the midst of a civil war, and that had a lot to do with how to read and understand Leviathan. This may seem like a very small thing, but it's an example of what of the danger that you run when you don't read a book in some kind of context. That doesn't mean that I have come over to the dark side and accepted a kind of full-scale historicism in which everything is nothing but context. That seems to me even worse than the Eberbrand method. But so that all that history is the barnacles that gather on the ship's hull, and the idea in its sort of pristine textual clarity or unclarity, as the case may be, is the only thing that matters. Context matters, but the text shouldn't be reducible to context. So there's a balance, and I think this is the right way to approach history as a study, as a discipline, as a way of thinking. There's a balance of the aspirational and the conditioning. The will, the freedom of the will, the ability to act, to be agents, as people like to say now, is part of it. And so are the conditioning forces that inhibit or direct or otherwise impinge upon the ability of the individual to act. That's the human situation. I know we're going to be talking about Tocqueville a little bit tomorrow, I hope. And some of you may know the very last paragraph of Democracy in America has an extraordinary passage in which Tocqueville, one of his many extraordinary passages, but in which Tocqueville says, I know, in effect, that it's very popular in vogue these days to adopt deterministic theories of history. But I reject them as most on the grounds of prone to produce an enervation of the soul. And he says that it's true that around every man a fatal circle is drawn, beyond which he cannot go. Unlike Peter Pan, I cannot fly, and so on and so forth. But within that circle, we are powerful and free, and as it is with individuals, so with nations. I think that's the right way to think about it, as so many of Tocqueville's pronouncements are the right way to think about things. So let me get into my subject, my assigned subject of history is a way of knowing, not just a way of thinking, but a way of actually knowing something. Does it make sense to talk in those terms? I think one way to begin is to regard history as a form of memory. Jeff, I think, has already alluded to that. Very commonly employed metaphor, and for good reason. But we often use metaphors mindlessly, automatically, and not really thinking about how much there is implicit in the use of them, how much they really mean. Sometimes they mean more than we give them credit for. And this, I think memory may be an example of that. We have, as human beings, an impulse to do history. It's intrinsic. We are remembering and story-making creatures. What we call history is just the intensification of this basic human impulse. But the cultivation of it is essential to the perpetuation of civilized life. Historical consciousness is to civilized society what memory is to individual identity. Without memory and the stories within which memories are suspended, we cannot say who or what we are. We cannot learn, use language, pass on knowledge, raise children, establish rules of conduct, engage in science, or even dwell in society. Nor can we have a sense of the future as a time that we know will come because other futures have come. A culture without memory will necessarily be barbarous and easily tyrannized, even if it's technologically advanced, because the drumbeat of daily events will drown out all our efforts to connect past, present, and future in a meaningful way. Memory, then, is a crucial source of continuity. As Emerson said, not often quoted at ISI meetings, but I like to be transgressive. And he's right about this. He said, memory is the cement, the bitumen, the matrix in which the other faculties are embedded. Without it, all of life and thought is an unrelated succession. It need hardly be said that the same thing is true of history, as the chief form taken by public memory, our shared memory. But something more needs to be said. We don't acquire a life-enhancing memory or a lively historical consciousness through the mere piling up of facts. It's not as if the more facts you retain, the better off you are. It might make you a good Jeopardy contestant, but won't necessarily help you in other ways. No, instead, memory is more powerful when it's purposeful and selective. It requires a grid, a pattern of organization, a structure within which facts arrange themselves in a particular way and thereby take on significance. Above all, it requires that we possess stories and narratives that link facts in ways that are both meaningful and truthful, and provide a principle of selection, a way of knowing what facts are worth attending to. This is how we can remember the most meaningful things. Meaningful is not the same as being detailed. Without such patterns, the facts are unremembered or arrange themselves haphazardly, and the past takes on the dismal form captured so memorably by the great anti-historical saying attributed to various people. I like to attribute it to Henry Ford, but it probably didn't originate with him, that history is one damn thing after another, which I think it's a kind of philosophy of history. You know, maybe Calvinists would especially like it, one damn thing after another. But an illustration of what I'm talking about is beautifully captured in a book that is not current now, but it's one of the best things I've read on the subject of Alzheimer's disease, not necessarily from the science of it, but David Schenck, the journalist, wrote a book called The Forgetting, probably about 15 years old now. It's not only an extraordinary study of Alzheimer's, but a meditation on the meaning of memory, and thereby, one might say, of history. Almost every theme in the book has some corresponding resonance for students of history. But let me settle for one here. Schenck recounts the fascinating case study, some of you may have heard of this, of a man whom the psychologists called S. He was a Russian journalist, and I quote Schenck here, he remembered every detail of sight and sound he had come into contact with in his entire life. This freakish talent emerged when an editor reprimanded him for sitting, staring out the window and failing to pay attention at an editorial meeting, and S proceeded to repeat back to him every word that had been said in the meeting to that point. And the editor, duly impressed, sent him to a distinguished psychologist who subjected him to a battery of tests and confirmed it was true. The guy could remember everything. There seemed to be no limit to the number of details he could recall. He could look at lists of numbers, random numbers, arranged in no pattern at all, and recall them perfectly for years to come, not just days, not just hours, but years to come. It seemed that the man did remember everything, and yet, as Schenck, the author of the book, goes on to say, he understood almost nothing. This was not a value judgment, this was him saying he couldn't make meaning out of what he saw and what he took in and what he absorbed and retained. When presented with tables of numbers that were in a deliberate and obvious pattern, like the ordinal sequence of integers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., he couldn't make out the pattern. He couldn't understand poetry because he uses figurative language. He couldn't understand the law because the law it relies on our having a sense of how abstract principles might be applied to concrete instances. He couldn't even recognize people's faces because facial expressions are changeable. And he lacked the ability to generalize these differences into a single, stable identity. I always wondered, how did he make it around the journalistic, the copy room if he was, now who are you? Anyway, he was chronically disorganized and struck a lot of observers as a man of limited intellectual capacity. Schenck uses the word dim-wit. I'll probably be canceled for saying that, so I just... as Schenck concludes the analysis of S, this astounding man was not so much gifted with the ability to remember everything as he was cursed with the inability to forget detail and form more general impressions. He recorded only information and was bereft of the essential ability to draw meaning out of events. For him, life was one damn thing after another. So I've dwelt on this for a while, but I think for a good reason. That it illustrates a healthy brain apparently has few limitations on what it can retain. Something else has to come into play. What makes for genuinely intelligent and insightful memory is not the mere capacity for massive retention, but a certain balance in the mental economy or ecology of remembering and forgetting. In other words, memory takes an active role in thinning out the mental trees so the forest can be discerned. It is selective by nature, and its selectivity is an essential tool in the mind's quest for rational order. This selectivity is neatly reflected in the etymology of the ancient Greek word logos, sometimes translated as word or account or argument or 17 other things. But it derives from the verb legein, which means to select, to select. So to give a rational, coherent, logical, logoi, a useful, true account of something, you have to select the details to be stressed. We all know this in our own writing, and leave the others out. We remember those things that fit a template of meaning and point to a larger whole. We fail to retain the details that are left like wandering orphans that don't have any connection to anything of abiding concern. So memory has to be, and by its very nature, is selective. One of the bases of this selection is going to be the needs of the present. The writing of history is always related to and draws upon and takes its bearings from the needs of the present. How, when you think about it, could it be otherwise? So long as history is a vital intellectual undertaking that is part and parcel of our civilized existence, then it will always be proper and necessary for us to seek out precedents in the past, and to do so energetically and earnestly, and not be content to confine the past to a comfortable imprisonment in its own context, the prison of context. Nothing in that respect has really changed very much since Thucydides wrote his History of the Peloponnesian War, in which he tells us that it was sustained by the hope, the fragile hope, that it would be consulted by those in the future, since the future would, in all probability, he said, resemble the past. Probabilities aside, it remains true that the past's few precedents are the only clues we do have about the likely income for similar endeavors in the present and future. Elusive as the past is, and the understanding of the past, it's all we really have to work with. And all, as C.S. Lewis once said, that's all we can genuinely know. So history is a laboratory of sorts. By the standards of science, it's a lousy laboratory. There's no doubt about that. History is the science of incommensurable things and unrepeatable events, which goes against every law of the scientific method. The commensurability and repetition are key to experimental science. But it's all we have to work with. It is the only laboratory available to us for assaying the possibilities of our nature, our human nature, in a manner consistent with that nature. Far from disdaining science, we should imitate many of its characteristic dispositions, the gathering of information, the sifting of evidence, the effort to be dispassionate and even-handed, the openness to alternative hypotheses and explanations, caution in propounding sweeping generalizations. Although we continue to draw upon history's traditional storytelling methods, we can also use sophisticated analytical tools to discover patterns and regularities in individual and collective behavior. We can even call what we're doing social science rather than history if we want to, but we really cannot follow the path of science much further than that, if only for one stubborn reason. We cannot devise replicable experiments and still claim to be studying human beings scientifically rather than corpses. It's as simple as that. You can't experiment upon human beings without, certainly on the scale required to study history scientifically, and at the same time respect their essential dignity as human beings. That's what they call murdering to dissect. This goes to the problem of generalization. Take, for instance, one of the most intriguing questions that faces people who think about history, and which is not always historians, by the way. What constitutes greatness in a leader? Is there a way we can sort of abstract the essence of that? There's a lot of leadership courses in colleges and universities and military academies and such around the country dealing with that. The word great implies a comparative judgment, but how do we go about making comparisons intelligently? There's no quantitative units, commensurability, no scales on which we can weigh the respective leadership qualities of Pericles, Julius Caesar, Genghis Khan, or as John Kerry said, Gengis Khan, Attila, Elizabeth I, I had to throw that in there, Napoleon, Lincoln, Stalin, and last but not least, Lyndon Johnson. We can and do compare such leaders, and we compare leaders in the long line of American presidents, and we learn valuable things in the process. But we can't really detach these leaders from their context. We historians just keep coming back to that nasty little word, context. We can't treat them as pure abstractions, ignoring such relevant details as whom they were leading, where they were going, and what they were up against, what challenges from within, from without, from nature, you name it. So leadership as a term means nothing if it's not leadership exercised in a very specific circumstance. How do you compare a 20th century democratic leader with an absolute monarch or a tribal chieftain? Yet what is the point of studying the past if each epoch is to be treated as though it's sealed unto itself? Comparisons are irresistible and perilous. And the more interesting they are, the more difficult they are. If made entirely without context, comparisons become meaningless. But if made entirely within context, comparisons become impossible. So there's a certain quixotic quality built into the task that historians take on, a paradox. And here's another paradox that comes very close to the essence of our meeting. By all rights, history ought to be among the most conservative of disciplines. Really, I mean, when you think about it, it's about sort of recording with minute detail the events of the past, treating the past as if it's something worthy of our consideration, of occupying our waking hours and contemplating. This sense of power and authority resident in the past is certainly part of the historical sense of historical consciousness. But I don't think any of you would disagree with me that that's not the way we hear it being described in most academic settings these days. The principal point of studying the past is to demonstrate that all of our inherited institutions, beliefs, conventions, and normative values are arbitrary, or worse, they're social constructions in the service of power, and therefore without legitimacy or authority, which drives from who knows where, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. For them, history is useful not because it tells us about the things that made us who we are, but because it releases us from the power of those very things. It demystifies them and therefore confers on us and our precious liberated selves a promise of boundless possibility. After all that's been constructed can presumably be dismantled and reconstructed in a manner that is more to our liking. All customs and usages being merely historical can be canceled. In this view, it would be absurd to insist that the past should have anything to teach us, or the study of the past any purpose beyond the needs of the present. History's principal value in this view is not as a glue, but as a solvent. History, as Stephen Dedalus said, is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awaken. But look at, any of you have read Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. He openly talks about the need to disengage ourselves, to detach ourselves from the sense that the past has any authority over it. It is a weaponization of history, as Jeff said, precisely. Now, there's a little bit of truth to this. History ought to be an avenue where our accounts of the past are tested against evidence. History can be even I'll go this far down the Zinn road, as far as Zinfandel, that's as far as I go down that road. History ought to be an avenue whereby the present escapes from the tutelary influence of the past when that is false. And I could certainly give examples of that. I think all of you could too. But the study and teaching of history ought to be directed at something much larger, not just the accumulation of knowledge and the overturning of myths and legends, debunking, but also, and this is something we do not do, the cultivation of a historical consciousness, the word Jeff Nelson used, and we're both, I think, indebted to the historian John Lukács, who was very much an ISI figure. He floated in and out of meetings. Very interesting, very unusual, very heterodox Hungarian-American historian. And this means, the development of a historical consciousness means that history can be, should be, an avenue whereby the present can escape not only from the past, but from the present, from the cognitive prison of the present, that sort of ceaseless flow of events that has a tendency to barbarize us. Historical study ought to enlarge us, deepen us, draw us out of ourselves by bringing us into a serious encounter with the strangeness and strange familiarity of a past that is already a part of us and that we are already a part of in turn. In drawing us out, it enlarges us, it frees us, it cultures us in the various senses of that word. It brings us out of our caves. As such, it's not merely an academic subject or an accumulated body of knowledge. It is a discipline formative of the soul. You will not find many history graduate programs in which they say this, but it's true. Historians should not forget that they fulfill an important public purpose simply by doing what they do. They do not need to justify themselves by the practical contributions to the formulation of public policy, although there are such contributions, and I don't deny it, and I wouldn't want to neglect that, but they don't need to resort to that exclusively. They do something very important when they preserve and advance a certain kind of consciousness and memory, a certain way of thinking, way of knowing. Traits of character upon which a culture of relentless change and erasure has all but declared war. Human beings are by nature remembering creatures, and as I've said before, story-making creatures. History embraces and affirms these truths, even as it insists on refining them in the light of evidence and truth. To do that alone is to do a great deal at a time when all the forces at work in our culture seem to be arrayed on the other side. So I'm advocating history for history partly just as a recovery of the value, the treasury of the past, which we neglect to our own detriment. We sometimes think of the past as nothing more than antique curiosities upon a shelf, little statuettes of marble and amber whose moments of living reality are long in the past. They're curiosities. But that's not necessarily so at all. Sometimes the past is far more vital and life-giving than the present, precisely because it frees us from the prison of the immediate and the familiar, a word that's cluttered and smudged too much by too many human fingerprints. And it brings us closer to the beginnings of things, the deeper beginnings of things. And the word archaic, for example, is generally used, it's not usually used favorably. Oh, McClay really gave an archaic talk tonight. That's not usually anything but a pejorative. But it comes from the Greek word arche, which refers, you can tell I had a smattering of Greek in college. It doesn't go much further, I promise you. Arche refers not only to the antiquity of things, but to their foundational character. They're like well springs, the archi. They're first not only in time, but in principle. Some of you know anarche en hologos. In the beginning was the Word, the beginning of St. John's Gospel. Anarche en hologos. There's an endless abundance in these ancient words because anarche is the deep spring from which all emanates. And it's a profound mystery because the arche is a cause, not an effect. The discipline we call archaeology ought to be a science of first principles. It's interesting, like to speculate on how Michel Foucault uses the term archaeology. It's really sort of digging up the dirt on things, literally. But we do think of it as a science of origins in time, and it really is both archaeology. Our fresh encounter with first things, and now this is the St. John's boy talking to you, our fresh encounter with first things can be startling because the very means by which we're nourished become vehicles that make us unfamiliar with the passage of time. Consider our reaction to one of the oldest artifacts of our civilization, something I know you all have read, the Homeric Epics, or you probably at least read one of them, the Iliad and the Odyssey. We often fail on a first reading to grasp their power. Maybe some of us never grasp their power, but listen to this description. The great journalist Rebecca West, somebody I urge you to get acquainted with, and her husband described their encounter in the 1930s with remote Yugoslav tribesmen who still sang and recited oral epics in the Homeric fashion. These bards recounted orally actions that, and this wonderful phrase of West, must have been made 1 million times since the world began, but that in each new telling seemed absolutely fresh. Thus, when one reads in the Iliad of a man drawing a bow or raising a sword, West says, it is as if The dew of the world's morning lay undisturbed on what he did. So far from being old and dead, the past draws life from its greater closeness to the archive, to the origins of things. In that sense, old books are younger than new ones. That's why old books and old myths and fairy tales are so full of new life. That's why these books speak to us across gulfs of time and space, language and culture, even race, class, and gender, without the aid of busybodies and other anointed experts, and have things to tell us that surpass even the wisdom of the New York Times op-ed page. Precisely because they bring us the news that really matters, the news of the human condition, the news that the newspapers neglect to print. They bring us an electric feeling of connection, a shock of recognition, as Melville called it, across space and time to others who've shared our human condition. History can do this too. But history is more than myth or fairy tales. And it teaches us a variety of things, among which is, I think, for those, a lesson that those of us who live in the comfortable bosom of a very prosperous society, even if it is somewhat declining at the moment, what Henry James, the novelist, called the imagination of disaster. The study of history can be sobering and shocking and morally troubling. It should be. One doesn't have to believe in original sin to study it successfully, but it probably helps, even if you're not thinking it's one damn thing after another. By relentlessly placing on display the crookedness, the crooked timber of humanity, as Kant said, history brings us back to earth. It equips us to resist the powerful lure of radical expectations. It awakens us from wokeness. It reminds us of the grimmer possibilities of human nature, possibilities that for most people living at most times and places in human history have not been the least bit imaginary. With these realizations in hand, we're better equipped to move forward in the right way. And so we work away in Cleo's makeshift laboratory. That's what I call history. Cleo's the muse of history. Cleo's makeshift laboratory, deducing what we can from the patient examination and comparison of singular examples, each deeply rooted in its singular place and moment. From the perspective of science, real modern natural experimental science, this is a crazy way to go about things. It's as if we were reduced to making deductions from the fragmentary journal of a mad scientist who constructed haphazard experiments at random and never repeated any of them. But the oddness is unavoidable. It indicates how different is the approach to knowledge afforded by history. It's part science, part art, and 100% human. Thank you.
We will now move to questions. We have about 15 minutes for questions, so if you do have a question, you can go right up to that microphone or this one over here.
I exhausted you all. That's good.
So how would you propose...
Can I just ask you to introduce yourself, but really more for everyone else's sake?
I'm Robert Sperlin from Oklahoma, and
good man.
Good time to be where I'm at, I guess. How would you propose, being proponents of the Western tradition, that we advocate that to people who don't necessarily buy into like the Judeo-Christian basis of it? I mean, if nihilism is an option, how do you put forth an objective worldview?
Well, that's a it's an abstract question, and I gave a rather abstract lecture, so fair enough. But so I'll give you an abstract answer. But I think one of the ways you do it is not. I think history and study of events is the best. I'm trying to think of a word other than the word I'm thinking of, but best defense against the kind of wildly radical and unrealistic and ungrounded expectations that people can have if they approach the world in terms of theories and strictly in terms of the theoretical or the spiritual, ungrounded, unmoored. And I just get, if you've undoubtedly read, as I have, all kinds of interesting comparisons of the current moment with, say, the intellectual climate of Russia in the early part of the 20th century. Gary Saul Morrison, the Russian lit scholar, has written some fabulous essays about this that just make you cringe and sends chills up your spine, not the kind that, the guy that got the thrill up his leg. This is bad thrills. Thinking of the parallels between the radical expectations of a significant block of Russian intellectuals and their total rejection of their past, and what came, which was horrifying, or the French Revolution, or even the 60s, the 1960s in this country, but maybe even more so in France. Those kinds of things have tended almost invariably to lead to bad consequences. I think that's one way you can begin to make inroads persuading people. But they have to be willing to know something, to learn something, to learn some detail. And you have to be able to tell the story well. You can't just kind of say, well, look at the Russian Revolution. Well, okay, I'm looking. Now, what do you want me to see? You have to lay it out for them. I think our side is not as good in translating what we know into more concrete, more, if I may use a psychobabble word, more relatable way than we're doing now. So that's one thing I would say is just look at even though Richard Weaver didn't really want to title his book "Ideas Have Consequences," it's a great title because we can look at ways in which bad or ill-formed ideas that are formed without a fundamental respect for the limitations of human nature, what we know about from the past, from what we've been able to glean from the evidence that the past leaves. So I think your question really is a great question, now that I've finally figured out a way to answer it. No, it's a great question because it gets at what's really different about history is that it deals in real, concrete, measurable details. And of course, what has to happen, and I don't deny this for a minute, that there has to be an imaginative sort of an act of creativity in bringing those things together, those facts that are meaningful, with the details selected out, so that you can have a story that will be meaningful and true. You don't leave out details in order to fudge your testimony. You do it to make your testimony clearer. That's what I think we have to do. I think we're in general very bad at narratives, and I plead guilty to this, and as long as everybody else in the room does too. We're culturally speaking, we're dominated by narratives that are just mother's milk to the left. 90% of Hollywood movies, although there are some that are not that way, and some of them make very big box office. So it's not as if we have to retrain the American populace to recognize a good and true story when they see it or hear it. They do. They're capable of that. Hollywood may not be capable of giving it to them, but that's another story.
Hi, my name is Liam. I'm from Gordon College. So here's a question. How do you communicate to people the value of history as a way of knowing in a culture that reinforces the notion that that the telling of history is simply a social construct to reinforce the power hierarchies of oppressors in oppressing groups?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the things you do is you throw that analysis back at them, because I mean, I keep picking on Howard Zinn because he's so much fun to pick on and deserves it. He's done so enough damage that we really ought to pick on him. You know, he's a terrible historian, not because I disagree with the conclusions he comes to, but because he's dishonest in his use of evidence. And what you try to do is take apart the narrative that all history can be reduced to sort of the relationship of oppressor and oppressed, and that some other framework needs to be devised. And actually, when you ask people like that, okay, tell me your framework. What happens after equity is achieved? And they don't have an answer. They're not really interested in achieving that. They're interested in taking down the current system as they see it, which may be falling apart all on its own in certain ways. But so I think you don't just backpedal and let them put you on the defensive. Say, what do you say about this? It's actually, I remember a moment from the honors program 20-some years ago when somebody started in about, and I was talking about John and Abigail Adams and how, because people were making comments about patriarchy and sort of, I said, do you know anything about John and Abigail Adams and their marriage and how she managed things while he was away so much of the time in Europe and in Washington and so on. And feeble responses. And then I said, well, again, tell me someplace else in the world at that time where the status of women would have allowed for someone like Abigail and for a marriage like John and Abigail had. And I was actually felt a little ashamed of myself because I kind of reduced this guy to practically to tears. But maybe he was a better person for it. On the other hand, he may be leading some kind of radical movement because of me. But you never know what the consequences of what you do in the classroom are. But you see my point is that I think one of the problems that we have, and I'm in American history is my field, and when people say kids need to learn more American history, they're not learning their American history. They're not learning about the presidents. They don't know when the Civil War. Yeah. Oh, that's all true. But it's just as important that they know what the rest of the world has been like. That's why, the notion that 1776 was an extremely significant event in the history of the world which seems implausible to these young people who know only a little bit of American history and nothing else. But to someone who knows about the broader world and knows about the way that Jefferson's words were received all over the world and still are today in Hong Kong, people running around with copies of the Declaration of Independence. And you get a different picture if you do that. So I think that it's not enough to sort of train people more thoroughly in the knowledge of American history. They need to have a sort of sense of the comparative dimension. Because to be great is to be greater than something else. I mean, it's a comparative term. it's a term of magnitude. So, and I'm not saying, by the way, I'm not advocating for the kind of patriotic education that's all just an endless loop of stars and stripes forever and saluting for 5 hours. That's not my idea of anything other than torture. But no, I'm not, and I think that's a whole subject that's very much on the table right now is what should civic education look like? Should it be a kind of sort of propagandizing for the country? It should be part of the national project, kind of like the earlier question suggested. Should it be a detailed, relentless account of national faults? Sort of the 1619 project carried out ad infinitum. Well, I don't think it should be either one of those, but that's a topic for another occasion. Others? Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Caleb.
Caleb, do you have a last name or you just go by?
Writings.
Okay.
But I can't just go by Caleb, that's fine. I'm from
Well, it
Missouri.
is kind of like Prince, Madonna.
Yeah,
Yeah, hey, this could be the beginning
it's
of
a
it.
branding
The whole thing.
opportunity, I suppose. No, I had a question, perhaps a practical question, maybe. I'm a philosophy major, so we'll see if it gets that practical. But I was wondering, given how easy it is to take let's call it an easy way out in terms of appealing to ideology to make the comprehension of history easier, going to Marxism, for instance, for a framework of understanding history, right? And so it thus requires more rigor to avoid falling into ideology when studying history. What is the place of the historian in modern society, since it seems to be a discipline that requires more rigor than I think the vast majority of people who also have jobs and other lives that are necessary for a functioning society. Where does the historian fall in? Are they the philosopher kings that Plato wished for us to have, or what does that look like practically?
That's a good question, because I think it goes to, and some of you are either in or going off to graduate school. I don't know how many, but and some of you may even go into history. I may try to talk you out of it, but because I think the academic study of history is in a very bad way right now. I find it hard to. There's only a handful of people, and really they're people rather than programs that I recommend to people, to students who are top-rate graduate programs. But and I bring that up because, the way that I went to Johns Hopkins, which is sort of the uber, first German-style university, research university in the country, and it was very much directed towards the professionalization of historical study. It always has been. And I liked it because I got through more quickly, but I didn't like the ethos, and I've rebelled against it from the word go. The idea that your principal goal as a historian is to write for other historians and to dispute small, sometimes large, sometimes there are large arguments over, and some of them are very interesting. I have a colleague at Oklahoma who wrote a book on arguing that the fall of Rome was due to disease and climate, I guess you could call it climate change, but the climatic considerations that affected agriculture and the ability to sort of carry the population. And, you would think there was nothing new to say about that, but this is a guy who's gone and he has new evidence from the biogenetic records and so on. And that might filter out to the public. Well, maybe that fatal circle of Tocqueville's includes disease, and things we can't control. Needless to say, his book came out at just the right moment. But I think we are trained in graduate school. If we have an inclination to write history for the general public, they do everything they can to kick it out of us, and for our own good. I mean, they're not sadists, at least most of them. no more than the average sort of cohort of any profession. No, they think that this is what it takes to succeed in the academic, and they're right. They're right. I felt when I was training graduate students that I needed to do that, even though sometimes it was difficult to find a topic for a dissertation that was both, met professional standards and gave them the sort of experience in the archives, which is sort of requisite and that kind of thing, but also could result in a book or articles, whatever, that would communicate something important to the general public. That's the problem we have. It's the David McCulloughs and a lot of journalists who write the history that people actually want to read. And there's a few, maybe H.W. Brands, a few other people who write mainly biography, which is a form that most academic historians look down their nose at. So that's, I think, behind the question you're asking, is that I don't think historians want to be philosopher kings, but I don't think they want to preach to the populace either, or see themselves as having a public function at all. The few that do think, we have these great progressive ideas that we've extracted from the past and that you ought to adopt. And this has been going on since Charles Beard, at least. Conservative historians who are, like W.H. Auden's famous line, "Poetry makes nothing happen," which he saw as a virtue. We don't necessarily set out to write histories in order to change the world. We see history as an act of reflection. I think tomorrow we can talk about whether that applies to Russell Kirk's book, whether that's a work designed to change the world or a work of reflection primarily. But I think you're caught sort of between two alternatives, each of which is a little bit unsatisfactory, maybe a lot unsatisfactory. And I don't know, I've been trying in my own way to sort of run down the center, like the fullback running through the opening in the line. I think I maybe accomplished a little bit, but it would take a lot more people. History is in a very bad way right now. In a way, I would not even say political science is nearly as sick as a discipline as history is. And I think things are going to keep getting worse because I don't think that the kind of thing behind your question is why should I be interested? Why should I care about what even the books that manage to make it into being reviewed in the New York Times or whatever? Why should I read these books? We don't take that seriously, and we don't take seriously, and this is something a bee in my bonnet currently, is that we don't take seriously the consequences for civic education of taking a relentlessly critical and deconstructive view of American history. If it was all just an academic exercise, then, hey, have fun, But it's not an academic. It's not. The effects are felt. We are overheard. And the effects filter out. It's not just overhearing. Effects filter out through the educational system. Someone like Howard Zinn, I would think he was kind of fun if he hadn't sold 4 million copies of his book and wasn't the most used textbook in the country. We need a healthy, popular, historical sensibility. It may be better communicated in the movies and in elements of popular culture than in the academic realm, which, as I said in the earlier question, that's something we don't do well, think about narrative, and we need to.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Doctor.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you.